So welcome everyone. My name is Marc-Andre or Marc-Andre. I am the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives and an assistant professor here at our policy school at the University of Saskatchewan, Johnson Choyama Graduate School of Public Policy. Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I am coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, and this is the land of the Cree, Saulteaux, the Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Dakota, and it has been for millennia. It's also the traditional homeland of the Métis. And we're really grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, share in its bounty, reflect on its beauty, and affirm and reaffirm our commitment to the shared, necessary, and important work of reconciliation, both in universities and in the cooperative sector. In fact, I'm going to suggest that this talk today has its roots in some ways in this reconciliation journey. About a little over 10 years ago, the Center, with the support of Federated Cooperatives, had a major kind of research initiative called Cooperative Innovation Project. And part of the motivation for that work was just this kind of idea that the cooperative movement didn't seem to be having a lot of traction amongst Indigenous communities, even though scholars at the center had long been researching the kind of nice alignment between the Indigenous communities and the cooperative model. And we have ongoing work in that space, so stay tuned for that. But out of that research effort, we had commissioned a large survey of Western Canadians with particular emphasis on rural and Indigenous communities. And in some way, the survey results we're going to talk about today are kind of a follow through with that survey, that earlier survey. We're not as focused on rural Western or Indigenous Western Canada this time, but it is anchored in this idea that we're going to kind of see how the work of Cooperatives First, an organization that was created from that research, has shifted or changed the landscape since then. Now, that's not the topic of our talk today, but it is a bit of the context for what you're about to hear. So today we're going to hear from our speaker, Charlie Graves, and Charlie is the president of Modus Research, and he founded this organization back in 2013, and it's a leading research firm that provides public opinion, business, and consumer research. Charlie's had more than 20 years in this space, and he's worked with many of Canada's leading companies, NGOs, academics, and public institutions. He's our go-to guy. Dion Fuller's on this call, and Dion and I have worked with Charlie a few times, and Dion even more times than me, because Charlie's just a fantastic, thoughtful, engaging, and smart guy. We really like working with him. In fact, I think it's fair to say he's one of Canada's leading survey methodologists around these questions of design and analysis. So today, Charlie's going to share some of the findings from a national survey. Like I say, it's kind of a follow on from this survey that we did a bit more than 10 years ago. Our survey, the most recent one, was last spring. And what we didn't know at the time when we commissioned that survey was that Cooperatives and Mutuals Canada was planning its own survey of Canadians, working with Abacus on that. And they published or shared the results earlier this year and had a nice webinar again earlier this year. And at that webinar and in that research, they found that there's this really strong alignment between what cooperatives are looking for, what Canadians are looking for today. It's like stability and control, and the cooperative movement. Co-ops offer this opportunity to deliver on what Canadians are looking for, and kind of satisfy this kind of latent desire for some sense of control over what seems like a very uncontrolled world we live in. So the findings from the survey we did with Charlie are actually quite similar. When we were Stan and I and Dion and others were sitting through the CMC survey results, we were like, oh, that looks a lot like what we found in our survey. And so that was nice to see this consistency across the two surveys. But also it kind of made us think, well, what can we do a little differently this time? How can we kind of add to the conversation and not just kind of repeat it? So we asked Charlie to kind of consider this question that was at the back of our minds, both when we were looking at the CMC results, Abacus results, but also because we do this top co-op issues survey every year, where we ask practitioners, what do you think are the big issues facing cooperatives? And every year, since we've been doing this survey, people tell us that awareness is the #1 challenge that the credit union cooperative sector faces. And so there's this kind of weird disconnect between what the practitioners are telling us, yeah, people don't know about co-ops, but yet we're finding in these surveys that people actually have this intuitive or latent or this inherent affection for the cooperative model, and actually seem to know about it. So, well, how does that work? How can it be that people tell us they love co-ops and seem to know about them, and yet people in the cooperative sector movement feel like the average Canadian doesn't really understand the model, doesn't care about it, doesn't seem to move on it, want to change their behavior based on this apparent knowledge of the movement. So Charlie's going to share some data and analysis, some regression analysis, actually, where we're going to push these findings a little further down the line. And we're going to get some possible clues. I don't want to oversell this. I'm hedging quite a bit because we don't have an easy or pat answer to this question. Or, if there's all this goodwill, why is it that people in the sector feel like they're not able to kind of capitalize on that? So we're going to look at some what I think of as promising indicators of what may be going on there. But I don't want to oversell it. I just want to give Charlie the chance to say what he has to say, and without committing to anything too aggressive. So just before we pass the puck to Charlie, a few brief comments on our event and how it's going to proceed. I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted and turn off your video during the presentation because we're going to record this and put it up on YouTube after we're done. Charlie's going to present for about 25 to 30 minutes. After the presentation, we're going to open it up for questions. And if you're online and want to ask a question, please use the Zoom chat and I'll kind of filter and ask the questions on your behalf. If you have any logistical or technical questions, you can reach out to Stan, and Stan will make himself visible here and signal to you that he's the guy to talk to if you're having any technical issues. And yeah, again, just a reminder that we're going to be putting this up on YouTube. And based on a conversation immediately before this, we're gonna churn out a little publication too. So with that, Charlie, over to you. We're looking forward to this.
Thank you very much, Marc-Andre. I really appreciate that very flattering introduction. So I'm going to share my deck here with you. Just give me one moment, please. Okay. So this is from a survey that we conducted last spring, right around this time, actually. And so we've had a lot of time to look at this data and conduct some analysis on it, prepare for this presentation. The survey itself was based on a baseline measurement of 2,200 Canadians. We did an oversampling in Western Canada, and as Marc-Andre was saying, we were trying to update some metrics that had been measured as far back as I think it was almost 10 years or maybe even more. And so we carried some of that forward. But the focus of the survey was on initially some broad contextual findings around how Canadians feel about the quality and affordability of the services they receive in their communities. And we had some additional focus on rural, urban, and suburban populations. And then we moved more into just looking at cooperatives themselves, looking at public awareness of cooperatives. And then we got into quite a bit of detail on perceptions of cooperatives. Top of mind perceptions. There were a number of open-ended questions in the survey. I'll present some of those findings later. And a number of different indicators around how Canadians view cooperatives relative to private companies, relative to government, and various ways to improve support for cooperatives, and looking at some key sort of messaging that we measured in the survey as well. We also looked at participation in cooperatives and what might be driving membership. And most importantly, and what this presentation will largely focus on, is the propensity to join a cooperative and what sort of things affect that, or what drives the propensity to join a cooperative. And that's going to be the focus of the presentation today. Just quickly looking at methodology. We have a public opinion panel. We call it the Modus Public Opinion Panel. It's Canada's only fully probability-based research panel. And because it's probability-based, you can actually calculate a margin of error on the data. So the margin of error on the data is roughly 2 points plus or minus at a 95% confidence interval. As I mentioned, we conducted this survey just around this time last year, actually from the beginning of May until mid-June. We kept it in field for quite a while to get a good response. So as I mentioned, we stratified or we oversampled Western Canada. And so what you'll see here is in these charts below is those are actually unweighted data, just to give a picture of what the actual sample looks like. So almost half of the sample is Western Canada, which is a pretty significant oversampling. You can look at the composition by co-op membership. 40% of the respondents are currently members of cooperatives. And then we have a collection of 20% that are past members, and then the balance being those who have never been a member of a cooperative. The data is all weighted by age and sex and region. So these data aren't quite what it looks like in terms of the sample of the data we'll present, because the rest of the data I'll be presenting to you is weighted data. And you can also see there the composition by rural and urban and suburban. We measured that in a couple of different ways, but we were particularly interested in getting a healthy sample of rural Canadians, which we got at 21% of the overall sample. I'm going to focus here on just some profile without presenting a lot of data here, but looking at the difference between co-op members versus non-members, because the presentation, when we're going to be looking at the drivers of joining a cooperative, it's strictly focused on non-members. So if we look at the number of Canadians who are these are the weighted data, so it's a little bit different. Current members at 36%, past members at 18%, and never a member being at 41%. But if we look at the regional distribution on this, is quite interesting and quite distinct for a number of different regions. You can see the largest incidence of membership in cooperatives is in Western Canada. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that, followed by Quebec. In Ontario, it's quite low. So we have not just 20% that are currently a member, but only 17% that have had any interaction or involvement with the cooperative previously. So there's amongst the non-membership group, you've got a significant overrepresentation of Ontarians. And but one of the things that we see in the profile, when we profile the data for non-members in particular, they're consistently less content with the community life than members are. I mean, they're not, really unhappy people or anything like that, but you see a notable difference between the two. So on satisfaction with quality of life in their community, 72% of non-members say they're satisfied, relative to members significantly higher at 81%. On the quality and affordability of community services that I mentioned earlier, generally across most of those indicators, measuring things like the quality of housing, groceries, education, and so forth in their communities, generally lower scores for non-members than for members. We also see some interesting findings in terms of the trust they have in their neighbors. There's less trust amongst the non-member group relative to the member group, and they also perceive less community support or engagement going on, and much lower familiarity with cooperatives. So non-members, you see 31% of them say they're not at all familiar with cooperatives, and members it's 13%. It's interesting. You can infer from that data that roughly over 2/3 of the Canadian population are at least somewhat familiar with cooperatives. If we look at non-members demographically, as I mentioned, they're overrepresented in Ontario. In fact, almost half of non-members nationally are actually in Ontario, versus 22% for members. And this also affects the fact that they're more likely to be renters than owners of homes. They're more likely to live in high density areas, or lower density areas are overrepresented for members. And they're also more likely to be immigrants. Interestingly, though, members and non-members profile very similarly by age and household income. So one of the final questions we asked in the survey was how likely they are, based on what they may have heard or seen, how likely are they to join a co-op in the future if one was available in their area. And you see 31% saying they're highly likely, 44% saying they're somewhat likely. Those are high scores for a propensity scale. When you've got roughly, well, not roughly, but actually 3/4 of the population of non-members saying that they're at least somewhat interested in joining a cooperative. And you'll see that these numbers are quite different regionally, that it's high in the West, but it's also very high in Ontario, where you have that very low incidence of membership. And somewhat surprisingly to me, in any event, the likelihood of joining a cooperative is lowest in Quebec. So the rest of the presentation will focus on what increases the likelihood of joining a cooperative. We conducted a multilinear stepwise regression to identify drivers of joining a cooperative. We looked at a wide range of attitudinal and behavioral variables to try to understand what might actually be driving that. And what comes out of it is that there's particular importance on the perception that cooperatives have a very positive impact on community life, but also that cooperatives are, when you position cooperatives against private companies, particularly as it relates to the impact on the community and on customers, there is very strong traction with those ideas. That really stands out. Like, we measure the same variables on cooperatives versus government, and it was pretty much polarized on that. But when we looked at the impact on the community and on customers in terms of co-ops versus private companies, it was very stark difference. Another factor that resonated quite strongly with people is the idea that cooperatives protect against foreign ownership. That idea, in particular, we have I think it's 70% that agree with this statement. And they actually say that they'd be more, that idea makes them more inclined to support cooperatives. And then some other factors that came in but are less significant is past membership. Past members are much more likely to be interested in joining a cooperative than those that have no experience with cooperative. And then the economic impact of cooperatives. So I'm going to present each of these findings through the rest of the presentation. So when we asked, would more cooperatives operating in your community, do you think your community would be better or worse off? Very, very strong numbers say it would be better or much better, and relative to the worse or much worse, there's almost nobody said that. So to me, that's one of those strong findings. And Marc-Andre was talking about, there's this alignment between Canadians and cooperatives. And I think generally that alignment occurs, to me, like it is, when you look at the familiarity scores, there's a lot of people who are saying they're just somewhat familiar with cooperatives. But I think on a value level, that cooperatives resonate very strongly with Canadians. And it also plays into, ideas about, local control and investing in communities and things of that nature. So when I'm going to on the right side of the screen, you'll see that there's a number of quotations that we have. Those quotations are taken from the open-ended questions we asked in the survey, and we just aligned them with what's related to what these various drivers that we've identified. But one of the interesting things that came out of it is that there's a perception that cooperatives would improve affordability and mitigate inequality. I'm not going to read all these quotes. And the other one is keeping money in communities, non-monetized alternatives, and also a sense of belonging. So that comes through very strongly in the various comments that we see there, and it's in keeping with the juxtaposition between private companies delivering services or impacting community versus cooperatives. And so those things come through very strongly. These are just a few selection of quotes. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of comments like this in the survey. So one of the things that comes out, I think, really strongly in the data, as you can see here, is positioning cooperatives against private companies has really strong traction. So you see roughly 3/4 of Canadians saying that the cooperative has a better impact than private companies on communities and on customers. And both of those two things emerge as drivers of propensity to join. It's, I think, just a little context on this. I've tracked this personally, for decades now in terms of public perceptions of corporations. And Canadians do not have warm perceptions of corporations. If you ask them about their banking and, are they happy with their bank? Sure. Service delivery on banking they'd be happy with. But if you ask them about, who affects public policy in this country, and overwhelmingly Canadians will say that corporations have a disproportionate impact on public policy, and they should have a much reduced impact. And so there is that sort of context for those findings. And I think that these findings are in keeping with that, is that there's just sort of a general antipathy towards corporations and private companies. So looking at the qualitative findings here, you'll see like some pretty strong statements about cooperatives being the last bastion of community life. There's a protective role, or they're non-extractive, non-exploitative. They enhance sustainability and so forth. But the other finding here is that they're locally focused and support communities. These comments come through very frequently and strongly in the open-ended responses that we had. And that's one of the aspects of this juxtaposition against private companies that, you can see in the comments here. People will say, well, corporations just take the money out of the community to make shareholders or individuals wealthy, whereas cooperatives keep the resources in the community to benefit the community. At least those are the perceptions that people have, and those come through. I could put hundreds of these kind of comments up here on that. Looking now just at the next couple of drivers that we see in the results. The idea of being protected, that cooperatives protect against foreign ownership, resonates quite strongly, and is in keeping with the idea of large corporations withdrawing resources or pulling wealth out of communities. And so that resonates very strongly. That's, of course, that finding is in the context of the early Trump second term, where there was a lot of talk about hostile talk towards Canada, and even taking over Canada and these kinds of things. So I think it's good to contextualize that. But 70% basically are saying that that idea of protecting against foreign ownership makes them more likely to support a cooperative. We also find, and we've highlighted it below because it's a driver, the contributions to the GDP or economic impact um, uh, drive people to, or would potentially drive people to join a cooperative. So that's it. I hope I didn't speed through that too quickly. I'm be happy to take any questions.
Well, that was great, Charlie. So much to unpack here, and I'm looking forward to sharing a written form of this with people so they can kind of sit and process some of this. I want to just open and invite people to throw their questions in chat. You could even unmute yourself. We're not that numerous today that that would be impossible to manage. So I just let you we'll wait and see where I see a hand up. Dion, I saw you unmute yourself. Is that an indication you want to ask a question?
Well, I could start just to
Sure.
get people going.
Sure.
Charlie, great presentation. Really excited to dig in more. On the comments about familiarity with co-ops, like the open-ended ones, were those same kind of comments coming from also the non-members? Because I think that was, those comments were taken from the whole sample. Are
Yeah.
the comments from the non-members who are familiar with co-ops, are they similar to the comments of the members?
Yeah, they're very similar, Dion. They're not as textured, obviously, because there's less familiarity with them. But we do find those comments and very similarly natured comments across both groups.
Just another call for questions, unless you had a follow-up, Dion? No, okay. I'm going to ask one while we're waiting for people to put something in the chat. Charlie, it's quite remarkable to me that there's strong impulse affinity for this idea of connection to community, right? And there's also another kind of stylized fact that I would say I've observed over the years is this perception that co-ops are kind of left, if I can put it that way, right? I've always pushed back against that, but there's this kind of idea that they're kind of lefty NDP things, and yet there's this kind of strong attachment to this community notion, and you have this oversampling in Western Canada where at least 2 of the 4 provinces are governed by conservative governments, and Saskatchewan being one of them. So I'm just wondering if you kind of have any, and you've been polling for a long time, and you've seen kind of political sentiment. Do you get it? Can you weigh in on this kind of political part of things? Is this a kind of cross-cutting sense or intuition about the co-op sector?
That's a really good question, Marc-Andre. The funny thing about looking at polling data of Canadians when it comes to broad sort of public policy issues or values and those sorts of things, you would almost think that Canadians are pretty left-leaning. But the political system doesn't necessarily reflect that. So, I mean, that's one thing I would just note, that although you can always, I mean, one of the famous things about, our elections is that Liberals campaign on the left and govern on the right, but there's a reason they would campaign on the left, because those things resonate. But those views, I'm not saying that Canadians are a bunch of leftists. They clearly vote conservative. They vote all across the right side of the spectrum and center side of the spectrum. But if you throw questions at them about public health, public housing, public transportation, they clearly value those things and are frustrated that there's poor delivery on those. So I don't, it's what I would say is that what's going on in our political sphere is quite different, I think, than Canadians' values and perceptions. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just one more quick observation. And again, I'm going to invite people to raise their hands or put something in chat. The interesting, we're at the Johnson Strayer Graduate School of Public Policy in the Diefenbaker Canada Center. And Diefenbaker was a well-known kind of advocate of a kind of communitarian ethos, that was his political base, was at least in part anchored in that kind of logic. And it just seems like there's this kind of real opportunity there. It's like the political parties are not leveraging, whether left or right, or they're or maybe they are, and I'm just not aware of it. But that just I don't know. Again, have you ever seen echoes of this kind of anchoring around community and responsiveness to community and other survey work? Is this consistent with what you've observed elsewise?
Yeah, it is pretty consistent. And we would definitely see, there's these shared values around community and the importance of community and being connected to your community. All of those sorts of things are very longstanding principles amongst Canadians. So I don't think that's changed much over the
Right.
last 30 plus years. It's bedrock sort of value stuff in Canada.
Okay. So we do have some questions in chat now. I'm going to kind of go. Peter Tushman has a question around the reasons for being interested in membership, and Peter's own survey work over the years is that the number one reason that people haven't become members is that they're not asked by their cooperative to be a member. Do you have any data or sense of why people haven't joined? Like, is it, yeah, can you say anything about that or
Yeah, we did ask the question around it, and of non-members, why haven't they joined? Or no, it was actually past members and why they currently aren't members. So I correct myself there, but clearly the opportunity is an issue for folks. Although we did include that in the regression work. So we asked people not just if they're members of cooperatives, but and awareness of cooperatives. But when we asked them about awareness of cooperatives, we actually asked them what kind of cooperatives are they aware of in their community. And so, there was a lot of different types of cooperatives that were identified as being in their communities. But so we took that variable and looked at people who are aware of some kind of cooperative operating in their community. Those are one. It didn't show up as a driver of whether or not they would drive, because we were working with that hypothesis that if people don't have the opportunity or availability of a cooperative in their community, is that going to affect whether or not they're likely to join? And it doesn't affect their likelihood to join, but I'm sure, so obviously, it would affect whether or not they can actually join a cooperative.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's so interesting. I feel like there's going to be follow-up questions to that, but I do want to go to the next question from Bharat. You mentioned that's around Ontario. Has Ontario always been, I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, but has it always been an underserved area with respect to cooperatives, or is it a kind of more recent phenomenon? Do you have any sense on that? I know this is a one-time survey, so probably don't have the historical
I
perspective.
mean, my sense of it has always been that Ontario has been underrepresented in
Yeah.
terms of cooperative participation. It's higher in Quebec, it's higher out west, and I think it does historically vary. I'm not the expert on this necessarily, but it does vary whether or not they're in a rural area. I mean, you can
Yeah.
still drive through rural Ontario and see all kinds of cooperatives.
Right. No, I think that summarizes my understanding of the situation too, Charlie. And it's like if you're thinking of the traditional driver of a co-op model would have been some sort of underservice, some market gap. Southern Ontario typically was well serviced by kind of conventional businesses because that's where all the economic activity was. But as you get further out into the regions, whether it's rural or Ontario or the rest of Canada, then you'd see the more
Yeah.
emergence of the cooperative form. We have a question from Bryce, has his hand up. So go ahead, Bryce.
I don't know if you can answer this question because the survey more focused on that recognizing or understanding what a cooperative is. But was there any thought into not just understanding, but that use of the cooperative? Yes, I know what it is, but in that same sense, I'm not actually going to go become part of it. I just know what it is. And I'll talk from my own experience. I've been in the credit union system for many years now. And I look back at back when I originally started in the credit union system, people were loyal. They were a credit union member, co-op member. You shopped, you bought that product because it was a cooperative. I look at us now. Yes, I know what a cooperative is. I love what it does for our community, but there's a cheaper product here. I'm going to go with that cheaper product.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's some, you'll see in even the comments that I shared in this deck, there's some comments around affordability that might not resonate well. But there is that perception amongst non-members that I think it's more of a theoretical perception that because cooperatives don't have profit extraction, that they're going to be a little cheaper and more affordable, when that's not necessarily the case. And particularly in times of a high cost of living and very strong public perceptions of a high cost of living, that there Canadians will be sensitive to price, absolutely, in making their decisions. So no, we did not test that particular issue in this survey.
Yeah, and there was a comment in from Peter in the chat that kind of points in the same direction as Bryce's question. So, love the idea. I'm just going to paraphrase, but love the idea of shopping at a co-op, but in practice doesn't always guide my decisions. You sometimes shop through Amazon, for example, and even I hate what they stand for because it's convenient and cheap. I don't know if you have anything more to say on that, Charlie, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. And I see a question from Dion. I'll go back to her.
Yeah. I mean, other than just to say, I think that's true. People will be driven by convenience, obviously, with the popularity of Amazon.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Dion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really tied to the last two questions, but also in terms of something Charlie's results found, and this, even just these notions of the perceptions of co-ops. So it was striking to me that the community piece is so strong, because to me, community is not a left or a right wing thing. It's like, I mean, people care about their communities, and they want to sort of live in communities that they feel like are, they have access to goods and services and those kinds of things. But then there's always that gap in terms of like what people actually do to support those communities. And so I think there is this sort of grappling with this tension in the cooperative sector all the time about the fact that co-ops have to provide the goods and services that people want, right? But there is a way that these things can be framed in a way that then pushes it beyond it. So like in the case of what just happened in the sort of Trump talking about the 51st state, a lot of Canadians galvanized to spend a lot more money in that moment in time because of the sort of framing and narrative, and even had major differences in terms of how they were intending to vote and how they ended up voting in terms of that federal election in Canada. So you can see these major shifts in people's behavior, even their economic behaviors, if you tie it to the right kind of messaging at the right kind of time, and that how that kind of can overcome sort of the more self-interested economic behaviors we all kind of engage in. So that's something I think would be really interesting. It's more of a comment for us to explore more in future survey research to try and unpack that a little bit more about when people will choose to overcome that sort of that convenience or cost factor to really support something that like what does it take to actually overcome that gap?
Yeah, and that gap, maybe, I frame this conversation a little bit as this kind of this disconnect between these survey findings, goodwill towards the co-ops, and sort of an affection for the idea, expectation around pricing and services and whatnot. But then this kind of reality on the service side, on the co-op side, where people are like, wow, people don't seem to, that doesn't connect somehow. People aren't taking that goodwill into it and joining as a member or shopping with us. And so there's that challenge is, I think, core to kind of unraveling things.
I mean,
go ahead.
I was just going to add to both yours and Dion's comments that one of the things that comes out in the quotes that we put into the deck, but it's also very apparent that well, yes, Canadians and the broad population will vote with their feet for convenience and cheap pricing and all that sort of thing. We see a very strong movement certainly in urban areas and elsewhere towards local production and businesses. And so and that clearly has traction. You see it very prevalently in certain areas of the country where you see a real focus on the value of buying locally, not just Canadian buying locally. So I think that fits in with a lot of the findings that we're seeing there in terms of the drivers.
Okay, we have a couple of comments. I'll just want to flag and acknowledge that Edwina has been chatting a little bit from Liberia, West Africa. Thanks for joining us, Edwina. I can't even imagine what time it is there. But Edwina works for the Cooperative Development Agency as one of their deputy registrars for cooperative development services, and then, like I say, chiming in here. Yeah, Edwina's saying that their main challenge is this linkage between knowledge and markets. So yeah, just to show it to Edwina. Brad had another question. Again, I don't know if you can share this. Any thoughts on this, Charlie? It's maybe a bit far out of your range of comfort, but there's this in India. They've started a Ministry of Cooperatives in 2021. Did you hear anyone? I'm guessing not, but did you hear anyone in the survey talk about this idea? Maybe some sort of, institutional support through government, whether provincial, federal, that maybe come up in the free form answers.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I didn't see the comments myself. I'd be very surprised if they weren't in there, because we did test a couple of years ago around the idea of the federal government providing some support for cooperatives, and there was very good support for that.
Right. Charlie, I want to just kind of drill down on something else. One of your other kind of this, and you say it's been pretty consistent over time, this kind of malaise, discomfort with the corporate form, non-cooperative corporate form. And yet, as we've noticed here in the chat and some of the conversation we've just had, people will shop at Amazon and Walmart and places like that, even though they might not like what they're doing, might not like their policy, their influence over public policy. I'm just wondering if they're like, do you have a sense of where that limit is? Like, where do people say enough is enough? Like they say, okay, I have this kind of deep-seated concern, but I'm still shopping there. But there must be a point where they get triggered, where they like, okay,
So a red line.
Yeah, where's the red line exactly? Do you have any sense of what that would be like?
I don't know, honestly. I would, I think there's definite variation in the population, and you'd want to be able to identify who can be pushed over. I think, certainly the group that we've identified as having a strong propensity for joining a cooperative are probably that population. But it would need to be, I think, more explicitly tested with what would push people over and what sort of trade-offs might motivate people to, move away from the big corporate model.
Be interesting to kind of, again, to test some of these red line limits down the line. So Stan has a great question here, and I know you addressed this because we raised it with you, Charlie, but can you speak to any of the demographics? So you have these non-members as the variable you want to explain, right? Like what would get them on side with the co-op movement? What about age or sex or any of those other kind of demographic variables? Any predictive effects there that you could see?
Yeah, there was really not much there. The really important one is just regional Ontario, and region probably is what's skewing them towards being renters, as well as overrepresentation amongst the immigrant population. But as I noted early in the deck, it was surprising to us that age and household income really, there's a little bit of variation, but it's not of any great significance. And otherwise, like we went through all the demographic variables, and we have quite a long profile of demographic variables. And there wasn't a whole lot there. The really big one, I think, is just that regional skew. But there is some indications that people who are struggling financially or economically marginal have, are warm to the idea that it might provide them with greater security. There's some indication of that, but it's not really strong.
And just a quick follow-up on that, Charlie, and I see Peter have a question. You in that kind of in the kitchen sink recipe for the model, did you have a political leaning in there? I can't remember now. No. That would be interesting to throw in there just to see where that lands.
It would be. It's very interesting because we did just some measurement. I think I did this with Dion several years back when we were looking at this. How people actually respond to that, and we probably have some good learning on how to do that better in the future. People identify very oddly across the political spectrum, and in terms of what sort of values they have, you wouldn't necessarily put them in this bucket or that bucket, and so it's very interesting on that level.
I would just add to that about the analysis that we did. The chart, like there isn't really coherent left and right perspectives, and I think to this point as well, I don't know if people are aware, but just recently, like the National Post, Colby Kosh had a big article very recently, like I think a day or two ago, about cooperatives in Western Canada, about how in Ontario, I mean, the NDP is talking about grocers and doesn't seem to know that there's this huge network of cooperative grocers in Western Canada. And so and seem to be, from that sort of a more right-wing news outlet, very, very positive about the role the co-op is playing in Western Canada. So one of the things I really have always been trying to push this is that the cooperative model is actually from, like, I think there's this idea people have from a certain generation of cooperators that people think it's a left wing, but I don't actually think people necessarily do think that in many ways. I think they think about the model maybe as a bit more kind of collective orientation, but they don't necessarily see the co-ops themselves as left or right wing. I think, and that's to this point about framing it more as community or locally owned and embedded, that translates across political spectrum in the research we've done on some of this stuff.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's great. So back to Peter's point here. It's interesting that a lot of the positives that people are kind of putting on the menu for cooperatives are not product issues, and yet the experience that Peter has with Canadian co-op retailers is they spend most of their marketing or a lot of their marketing on price and product advertising, and more so than in other countries, interestingly, is what Peter's observing. So that's kind of interesting. What if they shifted some of their spend to other messages? What do you think would be most effective? Do you have a sense of, how they could kind of, again, it's coming back to this question of, values versus behavior kind of thing, right? How do you?
Yeah, it's almost like if you try to put messages out around pricing, you're at a competitive disadvantage. The messaging, I think, comes out of the regression work we did. It's community focused. It's protection against foreign ownership. It's a great alternative to private companies.
Right. I'm struck by the fact that the cooperative retailing system in Western Canada insists, my understanding of their messaging is around you're at home here. It is a bit of this kind of community. They're invoking this kind of sense of community and attachment to community. And just relatedly, if anyone's interested, I think we have this linked on our website. I did a study a couple of years ago with a colleague where we looked at credit union annual reports and statements by the CEO and chair over about 15 years, right? So we collected all those. We ran some analysis using kind of text as data methods, now known as LLM, large language model approaches. And the clear finding was this kind of theme of community across this whole set of credit unions from east to west, that the executives there, at least in their verbiage, were putting that out there. Now, whether they're marketing, if you consider that a form of marketing, maybe it's happening there, but whether they're putting out that in the pricing, when they're doing the pricing messaging, are they also mentioning, we're your institution, the money stays local, we can't be taken over. It seems like there's opportunities there to kind of enrich some of the messaging. Any other questions? I'm going to pop that back out to people for Charlie. Charlie, was there anything else, like if you were kind of, somebody said to you, okay, tell me about this survey. What's kind of resonated for you? Like, is there anything that kind of stood out for you that you think, that kind of top of mind?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we've talked about so far, actually, that that it resonates strongly with Canadians, and I think one of the things that comes out really strongly that was somewhat surprising was just the extent to which the idea is an alternative to private company or corporations. It resonates really strongly.
Yeah, and then John has a question related to that actually a little bit. If you see any risks as cooperative boards, credit union boards, become a little more commercially focused, or maybe the representation on the board starts to look a little bit distant from community, right? Like all Toronto people or all Vancouver people, or they're pulling in the professionals, but they tend to congregate in certain urban areas. Do you see that as a risk for the cooperative credit union movement, given this kind of sentiment that's out there?
Yeah, I think it would be that we have seen some comments in the survey from people who were members of cooperatives or credit unions who said, why am I banking here? There's no real difference between this and going to a bank. And they start to look like those. I mean, in my the board representation in terms of my personal experience is limited. I belong to a couple of credit unions, but the board composition prioritizes people with corporate experience, in my experience, and so.
Yeah.
But I think it does translate into what people will say about certainly the credit unions in terms of how they behave and what sort of interaction they have with them. That it's indistinguishable from banks. I don't think that's ubiquitous, but those comments are in there.
Yeah, yeah, and I remember you shared some of those with us, and that is on the negative column. Yeah. This is from Dan Oler and Corinne. Well, they're hey guys, are you guys in the same room? So Dan and Corinne ask if there's this kind of positive sentiment towards co-ops. So there's goodwill, there's kind of strata of goodwill out there. And the question is, I think I'm going to iterate on their question. Their question is, how do we take this and mobilize that into the growth, new co-op creation, stronger engagement, but also, I guess, how do we get people to shop more at their co-ops? I don't know if you have an easy answer for that. A lot of this is hard to kind of lean into, but I just put it out there. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, what I've presented is really something that would be at a high marketing level. That
Right.
here's the sort of messages that need to be communicated to folks, but it will work on the local level as well. That whole focus on local, community-based, keeping resources within the communities.
Okay, so I think, and I'm going to give one last call out for questions. Seeing anything, and Stan has posted a few things in the chat. I think even Dion, or no, Natalie did. I'm going to wrap up then. I think, thank you so much. Thank you, Charlie, for this great talk. Thank you for your engagement. Before you all decamp, I'd like to draw your attention to our next and final for the academic season, if I can put it that way. There's hockey season, there's academic season, there's other seasons, planting season, harvest season, and there's co-op conversation season. Is on March 6th. It's always the first Wednesday of the month, but then we take a break till September. And our speaker is going to be Marica Vazquez Tagliero, and she is with a co-op called the Valoristes. And these are folks. What the Valoristes have done is they bring people together who make a living collecting other people's waste, either by reusing it or reselling it. And they're often known colloquially as waste pickers, because they give value to those items that others consider waste. However, those who collect recyclables, of course, this won't surprise you, often live on the margins of society, and they face prejudice from others, and in fact, safety risks their well-being. So the Valoriste Coopérative de Solidarité is Quebec's first bottle depot. We have a Sarcan here in Saskatchewan, which is kind of, I think, government, quasi-government entity, but they've created this in Quebec through a cooperative. And the goal is to improve the working conditions of waste pickers. It offers a voice, specialized services, safe working environment, and advancing kind of environmental goals by improving the kind of ecosystem about refundable beverage containers. So she's going to share the story of the Valoristes Coopérative de Solidarité and how the cooperative models helped advance safety, inclusion, well-being, and empowerment of these waste pickers. Registration for the talk is now live. Stan's going to post that in chat. And I think that is all for the day. Stan's also going to post a link to the CMC study that I referenced earlier on, and our co-op conversation, our last one of the season in May. So thank you all so much for being here today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. This will be going live to YouTube in short order, and watch for our written report that Dion has promised to do for us. So put her on the spot. Thanks, everyone. Very good.